So far, we've been connecting the dots between systems, emotions, and the brain. But while this connect the dots game may show the picture, it doesn't have any color without the subject of this module, culture. Ralph serves two types of students, basic literacy and ESL. This distinction refers to the context of their literacy education. And what's the difference? A basic literacy student grew up speaking English, but needs to build more skills so they can reach their goals, whatever these may be. An ESL student, ESL stands for English as a second language, grew up speaking another language, and English is, as the name suggests, their second language. Within these categories, there's a lot of variety of skills and needs. These distinctions can be one jumping off point for understanding your student, especially their cultural background. While not always the case, an ESL student typically immigrated to the area from another country, whereas a basic literacy student is from here. But it's important to get to know your student's culture beyond what these terms tell you, so that you can make the most of their existing literacies as you guide them towards the English literacy skills they desire. In this module, we will look at how one's culture creates multiple forms of literacy, and how these literacies can be instrumental to the acquisition of English.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. And how these literacies can be instrumental to the acquisition of English literacy. As with all the modules in this training series, this will be a general introduction. We expect you will want to seek out specific techniques and tools to meet more particular needs for your student. Ralph will be updating its training modules, so with shorter follow-up trainings to help you acquire these techniques. Culture. So, culture is the organic life inside the mechanical structure of language. It lends vitality to meaning and context. But culture is also very difficult to pin down. On one hand, there are aspects of culture that are obvious. Artistic practices, manners, norms. But why do these aspects exist in the first place? And that why is a much bigger topic. Just take a look at one of the practices unique to your own culture. Why do you do that? Take a minute to think about it. Pause the video, identify a cultural practice you participate in. It can be something small like how you greet someone, and give a list of some of the reasons behind why you do it in the way you do. Pause and take 2 minutes to write down these reasons. How did that go? I bet you could have gone on and on, giving reasons for reasons, doing research into ancestry and history. Culture goes deep. So, culture shock and code switching. Let's look at how that depth can impact a student's experience of English literacy. We're going to look at two phenomena in particular, culture shock and code switching. Culture shock is the feeling of disorientation or confusion that occurs when a person leaves a familiar place and moves to an unfamiliar one. This is particularly pertinent with ESL, as the student has recently or in the more distant past come to the United States from a different country and culture. The literacy implications are clear. The ESL student needs not only to understand the words and phrases we use in the United States, but also the reasons why we use those particular words and phrases in that context. Otherwise, they will not be able to understand those words. This brings us to code switching. There isn't just one culture in Rio Arriba or in the US, so it's also possible to experience cultural disorientation or difference if you're a basic literacy student who is from here. Cultural norms and the reasoning behind certain behaviors can vary from space to space. So whether you're at the MBD, at Walmart, a community event, family, school, to move between each of these places requires some amount of what is known as code switching. And that is the practice of shifting the language you use or the way you express yourself in your interactions. There is an equity element to these terms because somebody from the culture with the most power and privilege in a society does not usually need to code switch nor experience culture shock to survive in that society.
Code switching as a concept is really interesting. By definition, it's what happens when people who speak multiple languages alternate between two or more, oftentimes within the same phrase or sentence. In a more colloquial sense, code switching is what happens when people reflexively or subtly change the way they express themselves. So for someone like me, and I'm sure many of you all here, I thought up until about 4th grade that y'all was the correct contraction for you all. It was only after some point at around 9 or 10 that I learned that you all was the correct way to address a group of people, and that I should absolutely use you all, not y'all, when addressing important people and situations. As our world continues to be connected through technology of all sorts, apps and the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, I guess code switching makes a lot of sense as people from different backgrounds continue to come into close contact with one another. But when we look more closely at code switching and who's expected to make the switch, we discover a hidden reality. And that reality is that the expectation of code switching threatens true diversity. My first day of 3rd grade was at a new school, as I had recently been accepted to the gifted program, which meant that I would be bused from my neighborhood school of Westside to Tomoka in the next city over. The year was 1992, and so on the first day of class, I proudly donned my favorite Jodeci pleather new boots and my cross-color short set. To say that I stuck out like a sore thumb would be a grave understatement. My new classmates were in polite pastels and ribbons and bows and Kids Gap and Limited 2 fashions. I knew immediately that if I was going to fit in and make friends, I would have to change more than just a few things. So over the course of the next few years, I learned acutely how to do just that. I stopped wearing my Jodeci boots. I started choosing softer colors as opposed to the bright hip-hop colors and fashions that I had chosen previously. I started listening to Green Day, and I eventually learned how to act like my new classmates and eventual friends. Most importantly, though, I learned how to align myself not just so that I fit in, but so that I was culturally compatible. And I didn't know it then, but this is where I learned how to code switch and how to behave and speak in a way that made me a non-threatening person of color. As our society grapples with police brutality and protests against such violence have become synonymous with big brand ad campaigns and pop culture, it's a person's behavior which indicates whether or not they have learned the language of effective code switching. There have been countless instances in recent history where a person's ability or inability to code switch has meant the difference between life or death. Are you all familiar with Henry Louis Gates Jr.? Many people know him as the host of the PBS series Finding Your Roots, and still others may know him as an esteemed Harvard professor. Still others of us may remember him also from a 2009 incident involving Cambridge, Massachusetts police when he was arrested for breaking and entering into his own home. No doubt his ability to articulate and him being who he was and being able to explain the situation led to a relatively okay outcome for him, save the public humiliation of being arrested. For those who opt for authenticity, unapologetically deciding to speak with the accents of their homeland or their grandparents, or to wear their hijab, or to say y'all in the boardroom, there are oftentimes very real consequences that can be felt. Consequences like not getting that promotion because the client wants to speak to someone who sounds American, or being jeered at for wearing symbols of pride from your culture, while other people who appropriate that same culture make the pages of Vogue magazine. Or being told by HR or administration that your natural hair is inappropriate for work or school and will need to be changed to avoid disciplinary action. For those who aren't even deciding against code switching because they haven't learned it, the consequences can be even bigger. When I was a kid, I heard a lot of talk about Oreos. And I'm not talking about the delicious cookie sandwiches eaten best with a glass of milk, but I'm talking about the slang term, which refers to a person who's black on the outside and white on the inside. Kids definitely have a way of putting things plainly. But the concept always made me think a lot about myself, who I was and who I was becoming, where I lived and where my friends lived, the music I listened to at home with friends and family versus the music I was starting to listen to with my new friends at school. Deep down, I always felt like I had to hide certain parts of myself that I knew were still very much me. I had to be careful to not slip and say something too ghetto in front of my new friends, but I had to also be careful to not talk too much about cello or classical music when I was at home. For the person who's expected to code switch, to exist almost simultaneously in 2 or 3 different worlds, constantly presenting a slightly edited version of self, the pressure can be immense.
The United States has a complex hierarchy of privilege, which puts, say, a white dominant culture situation here, somebody of a white Protestant background, such as myself, into one of the most privileged positions. This is not to say that someone like myself does not code switch or experience culture shock, but just that the society's life support mechanisms have been built with a cultural language I can understand pretty well. So think about this topic in your life. How often do you need to code switch or explain your culture in your life? In what spaces do the cultural norms match with your own, and in what spaces are they different? How does that impact your effectiveness in these spaces? So pause the video and ask yourself these questions. Write for 5 to 10 minutes on this subject. When you get a student, you can use this exercise to empathize with your student's experience, asking yourself how often and in what situation does your student code switch and navigate culture shock. When you think about the amount of work required in code switching and navigating culture shock, you can imagine that all this work helps to build a unique set of skills. ESL students have had to navigate an incredibly complex international immigration system, take calculated risks in moving between countries, and find their place within this nation. Basic literacy students have learned how to achieve many goals without relying on some of the literacy skills most of our society takes for granted. Existing literacies. Your students' skills don't just come from their challenges and frictions with society. Your students' existing culture, interests, and life path has taught them many forms of language, many literacies. Take some time to learn and learn from your students' literacies. If you're confused about what I mean about other literacies, it's a good starting point to go to the foundations of knowledge, touched upon briefly earlier. Take some time to think about the literacies you use in your own life. Think about things that you could not do if you didn't understand a language specific to that task. But this language is not inherently English. For example, there's a Starbucks literacy. You need to know what Frappuccino and Grande and half-calf mean. There is a computer literacy where you need to know how to operate the software and use the filing system. Yes, these can involve English, but English is not inherent to them. So pause, make a list, see how many of your literacies you can identify in 5 minutes. Maybe you found a lot of literacies, and you may note that these literacies often coincide with culture. Maybe, however, you had a hard time distinguishing where English literacy ended and the other literacy began, and if so, that's fine. Your English literacy informs and supports all those other literacies, which all blend into your culture, just as your culture informs those literacies and your English literacy. The same can be true for your student. As you teach, you can use your students' existing literacies and cultural understanding to support the development of their English literacy. So let's talk now about coaching. To help you draw out your students' existing literacies, you want to take a coaching rather than a To help you draw out your students' existing literacies, you want to take a coaching rather than a correcting approach. An example of this type of feedback is that which shows the teacher or tutor acknowledges the student's thinking while offering an invitation to elaborate. As has been discussed in earlier modules, this type of feedback is positive without being empty. Example, good job. as long as the error students are making during oral reading does not really change the meaning of the text, there's really no need to correct it. Within the context of adult learning and tutoring, an exception would be if the learner specifically requests to be taught standard English and be corrected when they deviate from that. Let's check out this short video to demonstrate the difference between corrective feedback and coaching.
So we make a god these days. We make a ritual of feedback. And there's an awful lot of conversation, articles, speeches even, on how important feedback is. And we ought to live in a feedback-rich culture because we have all this technology these days through phones that enables somebody to give you feedback at all times. Finish this meeting, feedback. Finish this interview, feedback, 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 coming from everywhere. Like a torrent of feedback, a hailstorm of feedback. Here's the research, though. It's pretty clear. People don't like feedback. Our brains react with stress to feedback. We move into like a fight or flight response with feedback. What we want is attention. All of the social media products out there, from Facebook to Instagram to Twitter to Snapchat, everyone thinks this is about feedback. There's no feedback in those tools. Those are attention tools. Those are positive self-presentation tools. That's what they're for. And we don't want the feedback part of it, we want the attention part of it. Now you take that into the world of work and you got a team leader talking to a team member frequently about work. What should they be talking about? They should be talking about attention focused on how to help that team member get better. That's coaching attention. And the difference between feedback and coaching attention is basically which side of the fence are you on. Feedback, if you're not really careful, turns into like a grenade that you throw over the fence. The person's in pieces, but the manager walks off going, I gave them my feedback, did my job, my feedback was given. Okay, team members don't want that. They want you to come around to their side of the fence, look at the world from their vantage point on their side of the fence, and then help them know what could you tweak, what could you course correct, what could you adjust from where you are in order to help you get better. If you're going to do any feedback at all, you better do it in a coaching context. Coaching trumps feedback every time, because coaching is what the person wants. Now, you may want to give the feedback, but what the person wants is the coaching. And so that, as we look out in the world and the messages that we're getting, that's the big distinction that you need to remember. Feedback is only ever useful if delivered in a coaching context. Don't tell me where I stand. Help me get better. That's what your people are asking for.
Let's look at how the understanding of a student's culture and literacies can support their student. Listen to this passage and prepare yourself to answer a comprehension test. 4 zups in common use for padding the Wabbing power of parta-mediums are the basic parta-curve sieg, the interval sieg, the hot Greek sieg, and the z-sieg. What is the purpose of the siegs in the passage? Why do you need to pad the Wabbing power of the parta-mediums? How do you perform the basic parta-curve sieg? Pause the video and see if you can answer these. I hope you didn't spend too much time on it, because how can you? You don't know over half the words. This is what happens if you teach just phonetics. Your students can read all the sounds, but still don't know the words. That's it. That isn't to say phonetics are irrelevant. They can be really helpful with dyslexia and early stage learning. And we'll have a module on it later, but this exercise demonstrates the limitations. So what if you teach your student all the words they don't understand? And that helps. So here's the same passage again, but with the real words in place of the nonsense words. Okay. 4 methods in common use for evaluating the cooling power of quenching mediums are the basic cooling curve test, the interval test, the hot wire test, and the magnetic test. And here are the same comprehension questions as before, but the nonsense words replaced. Pause the video and see if you can answer these. You probably did better than before, but I don't expect you to have enough context for anything more than the superficial answer. What is the purpose of the tests in the passage? Why do you need to evaluate the cooling power of quenching mediums? How do you perform a basic cooling curve test? Now, of course, I've just given you a short excerpt, so maybe you would understand more if it was longer. But I would want to ask you why I would be reading this text in your session. Why would you choose to read a chapter in a textbook called Heat Treating, Cleaning, and Finishing Metals in your tutoring session? Pause and take a second to think of some of the possible scenarios when this text might make sense. So, maybe your student is in a class on metallurgy. Maybe they have a strong literacy surrounding the process of metallurgy, and all they need from you is some phonics and vocabulary support. Or maybe you have metallurgy literacy and they want to understand metallurgy. Then your tutor session will include extended discussions about metallurgy in addition to reading support. Just like culture, a text is so much more than what you see, the words on the page. You have to have literacy and cultural awareness about what those words are about. This is why, when teaching your student, it is important to understand where your student is coming from, where their interests are, what they already know. If you start with what they have, you won't have to start from nothing. Now let's talk about high-interest, low-level resources. The previous slide is an imperfect example because you probably want to avoid collegiate textbooks, even if your student is a metallurgy fanatic, because such texts assume the reader has an expansive set of literacies. You want to find books and resources that meet both your student's interest and their literacy capacity, and this text is called high-low, as in high interest, low literacy. If you can't find a high-low resource, you can always adapt a reading, say the textbook your student brings from their metallurgy class, to a more suitable reading level. Now, this is hard to do and imperfect because you are not an expert. As such, you probably want to look at the following resources first. We have several such resources for you. First, you can check out our lending library. We keep this library updated with great high-low resources on a variety of subjects. You can browse the library online and email us with books that you'd like to reserve. You can also, of course, come in person to the office and explore the books. And they are actually on the shelves according to their reading level. Second, you can check out Newsella, a free resource that allows you to adapt news articles to multiple reading levels. Let me show you how that works. Okay, so I'm in my account. And I've got it on the maximum reading level. Ultimate gift to our future generations, plan to laser map all land on Earth. It's not easy to read, you know. It's a hard article. So what do we want to do? We want to bring it down, maybe. Let's bring it down to the lowest reading level. So you can see how it automatically changes the reading level. Let's go back. Let's go up to the 970. Let's go back up to the maximum. And you can see how it's changing each time. Some articles have Spanish translation, so you can even flip back and forth between Spanish and English if you're an ESL student who speaks Spanish. So it's a very adaptive resource. Finally, you can ask us to buy a resource for you. If you find something that will suit your tutoring sessions perfectly, send us the link, and 9 times out of 10, we'll be able to buy it for you. As we conclude this module, I'm curious, what literacies did you draw upon besides English literacy to understand the content in this module? Anything surprising? You know, for myself, I drew upon the experience of living in another country to explain culture shock. So that's all we have for this module. I'll see you in the next module, and goodbye.